Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Sound Decisions. A little while ago I shared with patrons of the channel a pretty huge playlist on Tidal of all different audiophile albums that they may or may not have heard of before and might have wanted to try out. That sparked some conversation, and one of the questions that came through from channel patron Brocco was to ask me what my top 5 test tracks would be if I could only have 5. So while I answered Brocco on the page, I also thought it might make a fun video, so here we go with my top 5 test tracks for review. When it came time to select these top 5, what was most important to me was having a really clear understanding of what I was looking for from each track. Whenever I'm reviewing gear, I'm trying to step my way through a number of different assessments to decide whether or not I like how it sounds. So each of these tracks has a place in that process. Starting off, and these are in no particular order, but starting off I've got Sue or In a Season of Crime by David Bowie, and that's from the Blackstar album. This album is one of the best recorded albums I think I've ever heard, and I say that because it creates the most incredible soundstage experience within a relatively confined space that sounds a bit like you're in maybe a jazz club or a small venue, but it just sounds so lifelike and real without having an overinflated soundstage like some other recordings can do. So the things I'm specifically listening for when I use this track are that holographic soundstage image. So this is not about the overall size of it so much as the placement and the clarity of each instrument within the soundstage space. I'm also listening to the bass texture. It's a really complex bass. If you put it through a great setup like the Hugo TT2 and M scaler behind me here, you hear that there is so much going on in the bass, whereas on lesser systems there's a lot less going on in the bass reproduction. The final thing I'm listening for is that this particular track is very busy and very fast paced. There's a lot going on, and so really good systems keep all that really well defined and clean, whereas lesser systems won't be able to keep everything in its place and things can become a bit messy and muddled. Realistically, you could probably use any track from the Blackstar album, it's just that good, but that's my first pick in this list. On to number 2 now, and this one does feel a bit cliched, but I'm now talking about Lose Yourself to Dance by Daft Punk from the Random Access Memories album. The reason I've chosen this specific track is because it's got treble that is right on the edge of being too bright, but it is beautifully clean and clear. So this will really quickly show me if a headphone is overdoing treble or an amplifier's got edgy treble. I'm going to hear it on this track because things get quite nasty quite quickly if anything's being overdone in that treble area. The other thing I'm listening for is the punchy and dynamic bass in this track. So it's got a real drive in the track for this one, and again it's one of those bass lines where a good system is going to give you this fantastic sense of texture and tightness and control over the bass, I guess you'd call it, whereas lesser systems can get either a little bit loose in some cases, or they're not going to have enough punch and drive to create the really tactile experience that you should get when you're listening to this track. Now the whole Random Access Memories album is beautifully recorded, but I think this is the track that I'd go to get the assessment of the audio gear that I'm looking for. I just want to jump in quickly and mention that Passion for Sound now has merchandise. So if you like the look of this design, it gives you a bit of a laugh, you can jump through the link below and find it on a whole lot of different options of t-shirts, hoodies, sweatshirts, even accessories like mugs and tote bags. So click on the link below and take a look if you're interested. As always, I really appreciate every little bit of support for the channel, and it helps me to keep producing videos like this one and the rest of the reviews on the channel. So I hope you'll enjoy the merchandise and do keep an eye out for some new designs coming soon. On to number 3 now, and it's really important for me to keep a classical track in the mix. I don't listen to a lot of classical in my leisure listening, but I do like classical. I actually used to play violin and viola, so we understand classical music, but it's not something that I'm personally drawn to at a leisure level. The reason I've included Jupiter from Holst the Planets is because it provides a great recording of every element of the orchestra all at once. And what I mean by that is throughout this track you can hear every part of the orchestra having its turn, sometimes playing together, and so you can hear all of the different placements of the instruments, the textures and the timbres of the instruments, and of course being an orchestral piece there's also the soundstage benefit of being able to pick where in the soundstage are the instruments. Are they well placed? Are they well separated? And does everything sound the way it should? So from that point of view I find classical music very important in an overall assessment of audio gear sound quality. One of the things I particularly like about Jupiter is that it uses every part of the tonal range of an orchestra. So you've got the strings and the warmth of the low register strings, you've got some of the softer, smoother sounding instruments such as the clarinets or the French horns, but then you've also got the blaring brass sound as well to give you that full range of timbral and textural quality from smooth and rich all the way through to bright and brassy. So it's kind of a great all-in-one test track in that regard. Now I'm specifically using the London Philharmonic version conducted by Sir Adrian Boult, but I'm assuming there may be other great recordings out there of the same track. Moving on to number 4 now, and it's Flamenco Sketches from Miles Davis' Kind of Blue album. This whole album is brilliant for testing headphones and other audio gear, but I particularly like Flamenco Sketches because fairly early in the track you get to hear a range of all the different instruments. So specifically what I'm listening for with Flamenco Sketches is starting off with the piano, whether there's a harmonic richness to the piano or whether each note just sounds like a single note without the harmonics above and below. There's also a slight hiss in this recording, so if you've got a headphone that's got the right amount of treble clarity, you're going to hear that hiss there. If you don't hear enough hiss, you're missing treble. If you're hearing too much hiss, then you've got too much treble. So it's a little bit of a treble test, but that's not my main purpose for choosing this track. The main things I'm really looking for is the quality of the trumpet sound and the saxophone sound. So starting off at the beginning, Miles Davis' trumpet should have that piercing muted sound that's kind of a trademark of Miles Davis. So I'm looking for that first of all, but again there should be some texture to it. It shouldn't just be a single note. If the system's rendering everything well, it should have some texture in and amongst that single piercing tone. Probably more important for me though is the tonality and the timbre of the saxophones in this recording. Miles Davis played with 2 saxophonists on this album and 2 fantastic saxophonists in John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. And you get to hear both of their saxophone solos pretty early in this track. And so what I'm looking for in both cases is whether or not each sax has that warmth and richness, but again with some textural control to it. So this track for me is all about timbral accuracy. If a headphone or an amplifier or a DAC is reproducing things as it should, each of these instruments will sound just right. If things are off, those instruments start to sound off. So this track is all about that timbral accuracy. So we're up to number 5, which is Ella Fitzgerald's Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie, and specifically the track is My Reverie. The reason I chose this track out of all of the brilliant tracks on this album is that it gives you the best insight, I believe, into the tonality of the female vocal, and because it is such a simple track, there's nothing getting in the way of being able to hear all of the subtle details within Ella Fitzgerald's voice. So you can hear the breathiness, you can hear small sounds from the mouth and the vocals as she's singing, and if everything's being done just right, it should be sitting beautifully right out there in front of you and being rendered to perfection as if you're standing in front of her. So that's really there just to focus on female vocals, but having said that, the whole album is beautifully recorded and that track is beautiful with the piano backing and everything else just providing a nice timbral and tonal reference point as well. So that should be my top 5 done, but I'm going to sort of cheat and throw in 1 or 2 more tracks that actually come from the same album, and I was just having so much trouble splitting these out that I decided to share both of them with you because they're both relevant for different reasons. And the album they're from is A Moon-Shaped Pool by Radiohead. The tracks in question are Burn the Witch and Desert Island Disc. So starting with Burn the Witch I've chosen for one very specific reason, and that is it opens up with an orchestra playing a passage Colenio. Now Colenio means using the back of the bow, the wooden part of the bow, against the strings in a hitting motion. That produces all kinds of amazing transients and textures and interesting sounds that are very, very hard for a system to recreate well. It's a track that could very easily be used to separate a poor DAC from a great DAC, and also a poor headphone from a great headphone in terms of how well they're handling those really fast changing textures and transients in the music. Add to that the fact that every Radiohead album is so meticulously crafted, and the rest of that track has so much going on that is so beautifully placed both in the soundstage but also tonally throughout the whole recording that it's actually a really good reference point across the board. So again, you've got an orchestra playing, so all the benefits I spoke about for Jupiter apply to a slightly lesser degree, but still apply here. On top of that, you've got a great vocal reference point because Tom York's voice sits between the male registers and female registers really nicely. So you've got a really good reference point for those upper mids if you want it as well. The other track that I mentioned on this album, Desert Island Disc, is a fantastic opportunity to listen to an acoustic guitar sounding exactly how it should sound, once again thanks to Radiohead's incredible recording quality. So you can hear the texture of the strings, the plucking of the strings, everything just sounds so good. There's also that tonal richness that comes from the resonance of the body of the guitar, so all of that's going on. And then on top of that, you've got a vocal that is so beautifully and cleanly recording that you can hear all of the tiniest little sounds coming out of Tom York's mouth, particularly on things like plosives, so sounds like P and B, any of those sounds where there's air popping out of the mouth, you really hear that super cleanly on this recording. So it's a beautiful test for the tonality of the system and its ability to render fine details in and amongst everything else that's going on. So that's the end of my top 5 or 6 or 7 as the case may be. Some of you might be wondering why I haven't included audiophile stalwarts like Yoshi Horikawa, and that's because whilst everything of his sounds absolutely amazing, I find that I tend to go for tracks that are more realistic sounding. And what I mean by that is not that Yoshi Horikawa is using all fake sounds. They're obviously real sounds, incredibly well recorded, but I tend to go for things that sound like I could actually go and hear at a live venue that weren't relying on a lot of sampling and synthesizers and things like that. It's not to say that those sorts of tracks can't sound great. It's more that as a reference point, I want something that sounds like things I've heard before and things that I know how they're meant to sound. So that's the reasoning that my top 5 is what it is. But again, that's just my opinions and what I use to work out how headphones, amplifiers, DACs, you name it, sound. Hopefully you've found this interesting. As always, if you've got any test tracks that you'd love me to try out, drop them in the comments down below and I'll look forward to using them in future reviews. And as always, we'll give a shout out to anybody whose tracks I've used. As always, thanks for watching, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.